So we've already gone over an introduction to population ecology, and now we're just going to kind of continue on with a few more terms and a few more concepts that affect populations and are aspects of populations that scientists study. So one of the things we're going to look at are the growth rates within populations. And so there are many patterns, but there are these two kind of main patterns that people start to use to describe a population and a state in which they're in. So we have one that we refer to as an exponential growth pattern. And often this one is referred to as a J-shaped pattern. And so in the exponential growth, what we usually see is, let's say if we're just talking about cells themselves, that you have two cells. So say in an organism, it's a single-celled organism. They divide, now there are 4 cells. Those cells divide, there are 8, 16, 32, 64, and they keep going. But the thing is, we have a whole bunch of generations there, but the number isn't that great. It's not like, millions or hundreds of millions all of a sudden. It's just, a little bit more. So that is called a lag phase, because the numbers of individuals in the population, although they're increasing, we don't really see these great jumps in the population because the numbers are starting off small. So as they double each time, it's still not a large number of individuals until they kind of hit a certain point. Once they hit a certain point, once the population doubles, you start to double by hundreds each time or thousands each time. Then it's 10,000s each time, and then hundreds of thousands. So the population then starts to make huge jumps as opposed to just sort of incrementally getting more. It's increasing by incredibly large amounts, which is exponential growth. And so we could see this with other organisms as well, with the numbers of individuals in the population who can reproduce and the numbers of females in the population who can then have offspring. Eventually it comes to a point where, again, you start to see more and more and more individuals who can reproduce, and then they have offspring, and so ultimately then the numbers start to jump up as well. You can see the curve here is just kind of continuing to rise. So it goes up and then it just continues to go up. And this is sort of an assumption of unlimited resources, which is somewhat unrealistic. There's always going to be typically some limit, to the resources available, unless you had, say, an artificial lab scenario where you could take your cells and then you can continue to increase the volume of the container that they're in. And you could continually give them nutrients, because eventually they're not going to run out, of nutrients, and so they can just keep doubling and going up and up each time. Generally, what we'll see is more of a logistic, or what's often called an S-shaped pattern. So we still see sort of a lag phase and an exponential phase. But then it starts to taper off. So we start to see a decrease overall. And then the population sort of stabilizes. So why does it stabilize? It's generally stabilizing because resources have become limited, typically. I say limited, meaning that they're still available. There's only a certain amount to support a certain size population, which has a specific term. So the population number here, this is the population number, that number that lines up with the point where the population stabilizes is referred to by the letter K, and it's called carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the number of individuals, in a population that can be supported by the resources of the environment. So there's going to be a number of things that will affect the carrying capacity, which is, again, the nutrients themselves and other things that the organisms require, in addition to competition between individuals. So, for example, in this scenario we talked about with the cells, this increase here, R, can be also known as just the rate, of increase, which can also be measured. So how many duplications you're getting per unit time, okay? Because we kind of have time here, and that's going to be different for different individuals based on their either cells and their ability to divide. Even among bacterial cells, some cells can divide, say, more than once in an hour. Some can divide only, say, once in an hour. Some require several hours for each cell division. It depends on the DNA replication, the time to replicate it, and then the other proteins involved in the replication process. For multicellular organisms, you have to go through sort of a life cycle. So then you have the adult individuals mate, reproduce. Then there has to be an embryonic development. Then those individuals, after they hatch out or however they are born, then they have to become reproductive. So usually then there's that lag, the pre-reproductive individuals in the population, before they can reproduce, there's some time required before that can happen. And that's very different. Some species, they reproduce very young, and some species will reproduce not for a fairly long period of time. So those are the types of things that will affect then the overall rate when it's calculated. So the time scale might be very different, seconds or minutes or hours or days or years, depending on the organism or species, but you still can see the same kind of curve applied to a different sort of timeline. And so in these cultures, say with cells, what will happen is also cells can communicate with one another, telling themselves that they've reached a certain density. So once the density has been reached, the communication between cells is slow down or stop your cell division. So you might see that slowing down because of other factors as well. So we have kind of these two terms here, not just R for rate, which is very straightforward and simple, but this is a new one that is carrying capacity, and this is really important. This is a term that you will see or hear about a lot when talking about population ecology. So the carrying capacity of the population, or how many individuals the environment can hold given the resources there are. And this kind of goes back to even the beginning of our course, where we said that Darwin, his ideas on natural selection affecting the change through time of organisms was related to his reading of Malthus, who was really an economist, but was saying that populations, as they increase in size, will eventually experience limited resources, and that will then put competition into the population, and then that will sort of limit the population growth at that particular point. And that sort of thing can also then select for individuals within a population who are better at competing with others for resources and mates and all these other sorts of things, which is where Darwin took it and started to come up with support for his specific ideas. So it kind of comes back to this again. So that's related to this now term that you have now called carrying capacity. Factors that are then going to affect then the death of individuals in a population, because what's going to happen is that when you reach this stabilization here, you kind of have birth and death rates equaling out. And so there are some factors that will then affect the rate of death, though, of individuals in a population, and those things can be independent of density or dependent upon density. So we have density here, say, of a population increasing, and then there's some things that are likely to cause mortality. So independent factors are environmental factors, such as, say, storms. If there's a small population and there's a terrible storm and it devastates an area, it might kill the individuals of that species, or it could deplete their resources and they die. If there's a very large population, the storm could kill the individuals just the same. It would deplete their resources, the population die. So the density of the population itself isn't going to determine how that storm's going to necessarily affect them. All right, that they'll all die. So it could be like, other environmental things like a deep freeze kills off a number of plants. If there are a lot of plants in an area, if there are a few plants in the area, all the plants in the area are just going to die. The density of the plants didn't really matter in terms of that mortality event, the event that killed off a large number of individuals or even potentially a whole population. It wouldn't be dependent upon that. There are other cases where the mortality of the population, the mortality within the population, is density dependent. All right, so these are things like competition. The competition level is going to increase the more individuals there are in the population because they're generally going to be limited resources. So as there are more individuals, then they're looking for food, or they're looking for light or shelter or a particular habitat. And if it's not there, or they have others to compete with, then they're going to fight. And then that's sort of what drives then selection, which is what Darwin was talking about, that individuals will then compete with one another, and the competition will then result in the favoring of individuals with certain traits. Then they will be successful and have more offspring to go on to the next generation, whereas the individuals who weren't as successful either won't reproduce or won't reproduce as much, and their genes will be diminished or lost in future generations. So that's sort of the idea here. So competition, predation can also be density dependent. In that, if there are few individuals of a prey species, the predator then doesn't have very many to feed on, and so it's much easier for them to hide, for example. In addition to that, the predator may not be getting as much food, so it may not be reproducing as much. So locally, or around where I live, I've noticed over the last several years that the population of hawks has increased quite a bit. This is kind of related then to the population that I've also noticed of things like squirrels and voles and chipmunks in the area. They're always here before, but over time I've started to notice far more of them, so a much greater population of those organisms. Now I start to see a much greater population of the raptors, these birds of prey like the hawks, because there are more individuals for them to feed on, so they can it's easier for them to find their prey, and once they get more prey, they can also invest more into reproduction, so there are potentially then more of them in the area, and that will then kind of cycle through. Eventually, if a population becomes decimated, then that might deplete or decrease, that particular group of individuals. This also happens where some individuals do it to themselves. So some organisms without biological controls, without predators, will then say consume all their food in a particular habitat. So as their density goes up, they're eating, and the resources are gone, and they all starve to death and die. So this happens. There are places called sea urchin barrens. So their urchins are often, I mentioned this in a previous lecture as well. Urchins are fed upon by other organisms, say like sea otters, and urchins feed on a variety of marine algae. And so some urchins will then chew at the holdfasts of these kelp and then remove the whole kelp forest. They'll also do this to seagrass beds. So they'll deplete all the seagrass in the seagrass beds, and then there's nothing for them left. So these sorts of things could happen without predators in an area. So the predation is typically a good thing to kind of keep the population number sort of in control where it is stable. But it will be reflected by density, the amount of mortality. More individuals in the population, the more chance the predators have to find one, so their mortality rate will increase as well. So as individuals will then display different sorts of strategies of reproduction, we're going to categorize them into these sort of different groups. So the organisms, so these are called life history strategies. And these life history strategies are, in reality, a little more like two extremes of a continuum. So most organisms are somewhere in between. I mean, some organisms are kind of at one end and some are at the other, but the majority of them are, leaning toward one end or the other, or even somewhere in between, or switching between these based on life cycles. So we talked about certain plants having alternation of generations, gametophyte and sporophyte, and if we look at them individually, a gametophyte might do one thing and a sporophyte is doing something different in terms of the spore production or the gamete production and how many are produced and how many offspring come out of that. So some have more asexual strategies and then a sexual reproduction strategy. So the asexual strategy might produce fewer individuals, or the sexual strategy produces a lot, and those are both parts of the same life cycle of the same organism, the same species. So again, like I said, this is a continuum, but we're talking about some of the terms that we use in describing them. So if we look at this curve here, it's similar over here to this one, to the logistic curve. We kind of have the lag phase of growth. You kind of have an exponential growth phase. You have sort of a stabilization, but then at some point, let's say the nutrients are gone, so no resources, or the resources are diminished below a point where they can't keep the carrying capacity any longer. So essentially what this means is there may be a lower carrying capacity, maybe at some point it'll be found if the whole population doesn't die off. But at this point, we're looking at here, this is sort of the death rate is now increasing beyond the birth rates. They're not equal and the population is in decline overall. When we look at a curve like this, there are some organisms that are more adapted to the exponential curve, kind of where we look here, and those we refer to as R strategists. So they have an R strategy, which means often things like, we'll go through a little list here, they typically have many offspring, per event. So per reproductive event, hundreds, maybe thousands of offspring. Some different, like say marine invertebrates do that. Versus case strategists tend to have, then fewer offspring. So when they tend to stabilize in their population numbers, it's because they have fewer offspring. So it's some of those other graphs with the age distribution, the stable population, the pre-reproductive, the reproductive, and the post-reproductive actually are kind of similar, overall in number. You don't see a great widening in one group or the other. So what other characteristics do we have? So the R strategists usually put very little to no care for their young. But the case strategists usually care for the young. And often they'll put a lot more effort and energy, into caring for them. R strategists tend to reproduce at a young age, so very shortly after they go through development, they become ready to reproduce. Whereas case strategists, they reproduce usually at an older age. So they might go several years, before they are ready to reproduce, whereas the R strategists are reproducing when they're fairly young. Other sorts of things that we have, some categories, periods of development, just themselves. So R strategists tend to go through usually like a quicker development. And the case strategists usually have sort of more slower growth patterns. Again, to reach adulthood or maturity. So they're kind of like related to the becoming reproductive. Very shortly, they reproduce, have a lot of offspring, don't really care for the offspring. The ones that do survive then are ready to reproduce very soon, right? And then they just develop right to their adult size very fast, whereas the case strategists usually take a while to develop. So here we're sometimes talking about, things like a lot of different organisms, plants, animals, fungi, things like that, but say for things you're familiar with, large mammals. This is just as an example. All right, versus, say in this one, a marine clam, for example, that produces then a ton of offspring. Not very many of them are are going to survive. Their larval stage before they'll settle. And there's a number. There are other things to maybe say about efficiency. There's a whole bunch of lists. There's a list you can kind of go on and on and on with these. These tend to be very energy efficient. These are often usually not very efficient. Sometimes when spending their energy. So in the case of, say, some insects, as they're flying around expending a ton of energy as they're moving about. They may be feeding a lot, like a bee is feeding a lot, but some other insects may not be, but they're still expending a lot of energy for flight, and it may not be directly related to obtaining food. Whereas you find some larger animals, they feed and then they kind of rest, and then they're kind of using their activity. They tend to have a lot greater development in terms of their intelligence. So say the cave strategists tend to have far more intelligent and complex behaviors sometimes than our strategists. So maybe a sedentary or sessile filter feeding animal doesn't even really have a lot of behavior. It just kind of sits there and it just filter feeds. Whereas these other organisms have social interactions, reproductive interactions, competition among individuals, exploration of their environments, all these different sorts of things. That's generally then more of we call a K strategist organism, versus others that we say are more R strategists. Anything plants, some of the plants can be attributed to different groups like this as well. But often we're talking more about animals, but we can apply it to really a variety of different types of organisms. So these are kind of there's still a lot more to studying population ecology, but we've kind of covered a lot of the major terms and some of the main things that people are looking at. So we said that when studying populations, we're just focused on a particular species, just one species, and we're looking at characteristics of that species in a certain place at a certain point in time. All right, so that organism may exist in other places, but when we're studying a population, it's just that particular one in that particular area that's fairly well defined. We're looking at the numbers, the density of them, how they're distributed in the population, their reproduction, their rate of reproduction, and whether they're on an exponential growth curve, so the ages of individuals, are they increasing the population currently or not? And those things are, as I mentioned before, take time to study. You have to kind of take over several years and a few generations sometimes of the organisms to really get a picture of what's going on. And then as the environment changes, that whole situation can change, and organisms who are adapted, they will change along with the environment, and other organisms who are not well adapted won't be able to, and they might be lost from that particular place, not globally, but for that particular place at a particular time. So the next thing we're going to look at are how different species of organisms then interact with each other. So not competition within a species, but competition, say, between different species, and that's where we start to get into when we talk about community ecology, and that's what we'll look